Awesome. Now started the Craig Discord recording bot, which it can be either fantastic or it can cut out when there's 6 seconds of silence. So I'm going to do my best to make sure that that doesn't happen. Last time we did a negative maps class. This isn't one of those, but this is the last time we used the Craig bot on Discord anyway. We must have had 2.5 hours of discussion. Going over some script, going over the Becoming Animal plateau from ATP. And then we went back over the recording and we discovered that we'd only had about 30 minutes of the 2 hours and 30 minutes actually recorded. So then we had to, in our own time, go back and record the whole thing as if that never happened. But oh well, hopefully that doesn't happen again this time. So, I guess a little bit of context first then. It's not super easy to set Lacan up, but that's okay. I'll talk about what it is that we're going to be doing on these weekends for the next years now, depending on what's happening. So, every Friday we're going to get to Lacan, and we are going to start chronologically with Seminar 1, and we're going to essentially see how long it takes us to work our way through the first seminar. Have some free discussion, have questions, and also try to get down as much reading as possible. And after Seminar 1, which will hopefully be finished in a few Fridays, I'm not too fussed about how long it takes, but for some people you can get more out of it reading, but you can also get much more out of actually taking the time to discuss stuff. This is an experiment. We're going to see how this goes. Every Friday, the times may change. I'll try and keep them consistent, but at least I'll put times up at the beginning of the week for when we're going to do these sessions. To read Lacan Seminar 1, on Sundays to read the Losers Seminars, which have been recovered by Perdue. Lacan seminars have all been translated by his nephew-in-law, so they're all ready, neat and packaged to go. Unlike Deleuze, who did not get the familial transcription treatment, which means that his seminars have had to go through a bit of a data recovery project. Some of his seminars with Guattari are a little bit all over the place. Some of his earlier seminars are a little bit all over the place. We're missing the whole introduction to his first seminar that we have access to anyway. What is grounding? We missed the first few. He starts off with a Greek myth, but we're kind of missing how he tells the story and how it links then to his point on what grounding is and to the rest of the seminar, which is a bit of a shame. You don't get this with Lacan. With Lacan, everything is pretty much there, which is both a good thing for Lacan. Good for Lacan, right? That your seminars have been neatly packaged and sent out into the world, ready for us to read whenever. The only bad thing then, it's not really a bad thing as such, but there's some discrepancy amongst Miller's translations with the psychoanalytic, goddamn what a word, community, with the Lacanian community. I don't believe there is much contention. I don't believe many people are out there saying, Miller, you have destroyed, you have ruined the seminar, you have ruined the acquis. I don't think that's what's happening. But there are other translators and translations. You have other interpretations like McGowan and Bruce Fink, and of course Slavoj Žižek, who translates into Lacan into Slovenian. And they all have perhaps some very piddly, niche, small, very fine points of contention around translation and interpretation. But you'll come to find that that's true with any text. And I can only say that this is much more so the case with Deleuze and Guattari, considering that Lacan is very much one of the reasons for why Guattari especially enjoys the neologism, the new expression, a new word. Lacan, there's so much wordplay with Lacan, much more portmanteau, combining words together, much more wordplay, not so much neologism, not so much new words, but every now and again Lacan will throw something in there, perhaps a word that you haven't seen before, perhaps a word that doesn't really exist. And this definitely leads all the way through to D&G's conceptual thievery, we like to call it, their nomadic style, where not only do they steal concepts from the past, from philosophy, from science, they also like to make up brand new ones. They like to give them well, concepts like the plane of immanence and the body without organs are not their neologisms. They belong to Spinoza and to playwright Antonin Artaud. But you'll find that Guattari has a few expressions that cosmic spasm, all of his concepts from chaosmosis, and chaosophy themselves in particular, his uses of flux, phylum, territory, blah blah blah. I could go into Guattari. I don't think we should today, though. And so, to finish off on Mondays, we will be beginning with Foucault, with the essential works of Foucault. Foucault is the only one who we won't be reading in the seminar style, for reasons I will explain perhaps on the Monday. But on the Mondays, we will be reading the essential works of Foucault, volumes 1 through 3, beginning with volume 1, which I believe is Ethics. Which is fine. You'll come to find that will be incredibly useful when we return to Lacan and Deleuze the week after. So that's the plan. Fridays, Sundays, Mondays for the future. Times may vary. I'll post these up. Seminars 1 through, I believe, 30. And for Deleuze and Guattari, all their seminars and the essential works of Foucault. Now, there's only so much one can do to set up Lacan, but Badiou, for instance, Alain Badiou describes him as one of the most anti-philosophical thinkers. He even says something like, any modern philosopher today cannot consider himself a philosopher without first dealing head-on with the problems and the remarks presented by Lacan. Slavoj Žižek, perhaps one of the more famous contemporary philosophers today, living amongst us. Many know before they perhaps even get into philosophy themselves. Lacan is one of the big heads, one of the key head figures for the theories that Lacan produces, so that Žižek produces of ideology in the sublime object, of less than nothing, of dialectical materialism through the lens of Hegel. Well, Marx is already in this way, but specifically using Lacan to fill the gaps, so to speak, using his conceptual language, using his ideas of psychoanalysis, his meta-commentary on Freud, which was already a big thing for what we call critical theory in the Frankfurt School. Thinkers like Adorno and Horkheimer and Marcuse, who's a later Frankfurt thinker, were already conceiving of this libidinal economic model, you could call it, between, or Freudo-Marxism as it's often called, these two domains of thought, of psychoanalysis, beginning with Sigmund Freud, and materialism, dialectical materialism, or critique of political economy from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, to combine these two schools together to create a new systematic framework of thought, which has only become more and more developed throughout the years and throughout what we call continental philosophy. Someone, and I just did as well, but I had this, I believe this is from someone who works with Platypus Review, so a leftist thinker and writer and theorist, calls Lacan a meta-commentary on Freud and nothing else. In the same way that some people say that Slavoj Žižek doesn't do anything new, he just teaches already fashioned concepts, and some say that Lacan teaches nothing new, he just teaches Freud. I don't really think that's fair, personally. I don't think that's fair at all. I think Žižek does come up with new concepts, and I think Lacan's framework does not stay firmly within the playground of Freud, within the ballpark of Freud. I think Lacan makes many, many swift exits, if you will, many swift exits. He comes across problems in Freud. Now, there's a lot of Freud, of course. One should perhaps be on somewhat familiar terms with Freud before entering into Lacan. That's almost a given. I mean, this first seminar is on Freud's techniques, so that's a big giveaway. And of course, Lacan is what we are doing here is psychoanalysis, and what will then later be explored as Lacanian psychoanalysis. There's a lot of other things going on here too. You have the influence of the structuralist thinkers and movements from de Saussure, Ferdinand de Saussure's course on general linguistics, which introduces to us concepts like that will come up absolutely almost all the time, like diachrony and synchrony, like signifiers and their signifieds, like la langue and la parole, which will be things that we explore later on. at least with Lacan as well. Also, there are so many since it's been translated quite well, and it's been kept so pristine in terms of accessibility and readability. Not that it isn't difficult, goodness me, but there are lots of things online to help you with Lacan. You have no subject, the Wikipedia. You have larval subjects. You have YouTubes like Master Sigma Bodies, who are now reading Seminar 1. You have Sublimity Singularity, I believe his name is, who's reading Heidegger's Being in Time and Lacan seminars. You have Julian de Medeiros and the Learning Community, and his weekly lectures, which cover Zizek, Hegel, Marx, Lacan. There's getting to be quite a lot of there's a lot of roots into Lacan, epoch philosophy as well, plastic pills. But here we're going to head into the text, because it's very difficult. I've done quite a lot of this secondary research, but myself, I've only really briefly entered into the text of Lacan. This is perhaps one of the first times I actually will, for realsies, take a deep dive into Lacan's decree, into his seminars, not just picking it out for quotes, but to actually get what he says, what he said, and not just what he said through the lens of what someone else thinks he said. Hopefully that's enough context. Sorry, but it's difficult. I don't want to spend too long on just contextualizing, because God, we could spend ages down that rabbit hole. So here we have an overture to the seminar. Before the seminar begins, this is a good little intro. Before we get into Lacan himself and his words and what he wanted to teach the students of Paris 8 and of France about Freud's techniques. The master breaks the silence with anything, with a sarcastic remark, with a kickstart. That is how a Buddhist master conducts his search for meaning, according to the technique of Zen. It behoves the students to find out for themselves the answer to their own questions. The master does not teach ex cathedra, a ready-made science. He supplies an answer when the students are on the verge of finding it. This kind of teaching is a refusal of any system. It uncovers a thought in motion, nonetheless vulnerable to systematization, since it necessarily possesses a dogmatic aspect. Freud's thought is the most perennially open to revision. It is a mistake to reduce it to a collection of hackneyed phrases. Each of his ideas possesses a vitality of its own, and this is precisely what one calls the dialectic. Certain of these ideas were, at a given moment, indispensable to Freud, because they supplied an answer to a question that he had formulated previously in other terms. Hence, one only gains a sense of their value by relocating them in their context. But it is not enough to do some history, the history of thought, and to say that Freud lived in a scientistic century. Rather, with the interpretation of dreams, something of a different essence, of a concrete psychological density, is reintroduced, namely, meaning. From the scientistic point of view, Freud appeared at this point to revert to the most archaic thinking, reading something in dreams. He later returns to causal explanations. But when one interprets a dream, one is always up to one's neck in meaning. What is at issue is the subjectivity of the subject, in his desires, in her relation to his environment, to others, to life itself. Our task here is to reintroduce the register of meaning, a register that must itself be reintegrated on its own level. Bruck, Ludwig, Helmholtz, Dubotz, Raymond had instituted a kind of pledged faith. Everything reduces down to physical forces, those of attraction and repulsion. Once one takes these as premises, there's no reason to go beyond them. If Freud did go beyond them, it is because he also took on others. He dared to attach importance to what was happening to him, to the antinomies of his childhood, to his neurotic problems, to his dreams. That is why Freud is for us all a man beset, like anyone else's, by all the contingencies: death, woman, father. This represents a return to origins, and barely warrants being called a science. What holds good in the art of the expert cook, who knows how to join a bird, to disjoint it with as little resistance as possible, is also true for psychoanalysis. We know that there is a method of conceptualization proper to each structure, but since this leads to complications, one prefers to cling to a monistic notion of a deduction of the world. That's how one goes astray. One has to realize that we do our dissecting with concepts, not with a knife. Concepts have their specific order in reality. They do not emerge out of human experience. If they did, they would be well made. The first appellations arise out of words themselves. They are instruments for delineating things. Hence, science remains in darkness for a long time, entangled in language. At first, there is language already formed, which we use as we would a very poor instrument, and from time to time reversals occur, from phlogiston to oxygen, for instance. Lavoisier introduces the right concept, oxygen, at the same time as his phlogistic. The root of the difficulty is that you can only introduce symbols, mathematical or otherwise, by using everyday language, since you have, after all, to explain what you are going to do with them. You are them, as you are then at a certain level of human exchange, the level of healer in this instance. And so is Freud, despite his denial. But as Jones has demonstrated, he imposed upon himself right from the beginning the discipline of not dabbling in the speculation to which his nature inclined him. He submitted himself to the discipline of the facts, of the laboratory. He distanced himself from the wrong language. Let us now turn to the notion of the subject. When one brings it in, one brings in oneself. The man speaking to you is a man like any other. He makes use of the wrong language. Oneself is then at issue. Thus, Freud knew from the beginning that he would only make progress in the analysis of the neuroses if he analyzed himself. The growing importance attributed today to countertransference means that it is a recognized fact that in analysis, the patient is not alone. There are two of us, and not only two. Phenomenologically, the analytic situation is a structure. That is to say, that it is only through the certain phenomena are isolable, separable. It is another structure, that of subjectivity, which gives human beings the idea that they are comprehensible to themselves. Hence, being neurotic can help one become a good psychoanalyst. And at the beginning it helped Freud, like Monsieur Jourdain with his prose. We make sense nonsense. We misunderstand, but the lines of structure still had to be found there. Carl Jung as well, to his own amazement, rediscovers in the symbols of dreams and religions certain archetypes proper to the human race. This is also a structure, but differing from the analytic structure. Freud introduced the determinism proper to this structure, hence the ambiguity that is to be found throughout his corpus. For example, is a dream desire or the recognition of desire? Or again, the ego is on the one hand like an empty egg, differentiated at its surface through contact with the world of perception. But it is also, each time we encounter it, that which says no, or me, I, which says one, which speaks about others, which expresses itself in different registers. We are going to employ the techniques of an art of dialogue, like the good cook. We have to know what joints and what resistances we will encounter. The superego is a law deprived of meaning, but one which nevertheless only sustains itself by language. If I say you turn to the right, it's to allow the other to bring his language into line with mine. I think of what goes through his head when I speak to him, This attempt to find an agreement constitutes the communication specific to language. This you is so fundamental that it arises before consciousness. Censorship, for example, which is intentional, nevertheless comes into action before consciousness, functioning with vigilance. You is not a signal, but a reference to the other. It is order and love. In the same way, the ego ideal is an organism of defense established by the ego in order to extend the subject's satisfaction. But it is also the function that depresses most, in the psychiatric meaning of the term. The id is not reducible to a pure and objective given, to the drives of the subject. An analysis never leads to specifying a given quantity of aggressivity or erotism. The point to which analysis leads, the end point of the dialectic of existential recognition, is you are this. In practice, this ideal is never reached. The ideal of analysis is not complete self-mastery, the absence of passion. It is to render the subject capable of sustaining the analytic dialogue, to speak neither too early nor too late. Such is the aim of a training analysis. The introduction of an order of determinations into human existence, into the domain of meaning, is what we call reason. Freud's discovery is the rediscovery, on fallow ground, of reason. And that's the end to the overture to the seminar, which begins our next, the moment of resistance, the beginning of seminar 1. Little contextual bit there, and I haven't actually read that before. That was really good. If you're familiar with D&G, and the whole point of these 3 reading groups to go on at the same time is that you will come to find that there are much more alike with these 3 thinkers, Lacan, Deleuze, and Foucault, and in brackets Guattari, who I want to mention all the time. I don't want to give him the Engels treatment. Use a lot of shared language. All 3 speak about Freud in some way, and especially critically. Deleuze and Guattari, you'll find this the most as well. You'll find in their 5 Principles of Psychoanalysis, you'll find in their Anti-Oedipus, which also responds to Lacan, in their 1000 Plateau. They are constantly referring back to the Freudian terms, just like is being done here with Lacan. The id, the superego, the ego. And now we're getting some of the stuff that Lacan finds necessary to introduce to the moments of what we call resistance in this language. We also get here this idea of the subject is a signifier in exchange for another signifier, which comes up much later on in Lacan, which means that the subject comes to represent themselves in language, where we also get our famous, the unconscious is structured like a language. The same is true for Guattari, who, after we have a look at with Spinoza, Nietzsche, and Marx, kind of creates this materialist, not to say that Lacan isn't, but focuses heavily on this materialist aspect of the language and how the subject comes to find themselves. In fact, Lacan says here that the subject, like the dream or the ego, is like an empty egg, which is precisely the same language that Deleuze and Guattari use to describe their body without organs. So there's a lot going on in just these 4 pages already. Freud, the dialectic, a list of writers, the idea of the history of science coming into importance with Freud's psychoanalysis, Freud's techniques, how in many ways both what Freud attempts to do is both within the leagues of science, but also necessarily extensive to science, always trying to do something that science can't necessarily do. This is the question that comes up with psychoanalysis quite a lot. Is it like a religion? Is it like a science? Is it its own separate thing? And this gets to be discussed by Lacan quite a bit, with different things to say. Sometimes he says psychoanalysis is exactly like a science, a new science. Not to quote, and other times he says exactly, psychoanalysis is not a science. If anything, it's much more like a religion, but it's not a religion either. So he doesn't really like to define. He doesn't like to define terms straight away. This is something that you'll also come to find in reading Lacan. You can't really go, what's the big other? Oh, what's this? necessarily Lacan wants to lead you on a trail of your own thinking. Just like he says at the beginning here, when the master speaks, like the Buddha's Zen master, they always start speech, but they only supply answers when you're already on the verge of receiving your own answer. They try and avoid systematization of thought, and they want you to develop your own systems of thought, or meta systems of thought, which is exactly what D&G tried to produce out of their own semiotics. But this is all stuff that we'll get into, definitely. What we haven't seen yet then is the three registers, like I brought up before, which get developed in this first seminar, and then throughout the rest of the Acquis, for the rest of Lacan's seminars. The imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, which are necessary to both counter and to develop concepts out of Freud, to deal with the resistances that we will find in Freud's techniques. But we already have superego id and ego ideal, which, to just briefly go over, is the free, the central, it's like the tripartite, much like Socrates' description of the human as the soul, the appetite, and the reason in the Republic. But here we have Freud's conception, which I believe is a translation from his original terms, the self, the over-self, and the under-I, which can make more sense than superego, ego, id being the most confusing of the terms. But they simply refer to the superego, or the morality principle, as it also gets called in Freud's texts. The outside influence, the over-self, the part of you that watches you, that shuts you down, that tells you what's right and what's wrong. And then you have the id, which gets its own development in quite a few different texts of the uncanny, or the id, and the beyond the pleasure principle. Yeah, the id is the pleasure principle, so to speak. It's the basic, formless, carnal, natural, or of course there, natural, terrible word. Got to be careful when using that word. Drives, or trieb is the word in German. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Trieb, which comes to mean something like drive or instinct. For instance, a deaf instinct, the Mordstrieb. And these drives are already within you, already there, latent, out of this intrapsychic conflict between over-self and under-I, between the I which watches myself and the I which simply wants to do whatever it is that it wants to do. You are the intermediary, the result, and that thus you are always a split subject, as Lacan will come on to say, split between you, the conscious self, and you, the unconscious self, or you and your drives, and you and the very thing which stops you from satisfying your drives, which we develop from the other. And this is also how we develop desire. Now, let's get into Seminar 1, Introduction to the Commentaries on Freud's papers on technique. I would very much like to start off this new year, for which I offer you my best wishes, by telling you the fun is over. Last term you had little else to do, but listen to me. I declare that this term now starting, I trust, I hope, I venture to hope that I too will hear from you a bit. It's actually the law and tradition of the seminar that those who participate in it bring more to it than a purely personal effort, a contribution through effective communication. This can only come from those involved in the work in the most direct manner. From those for whom these seminars on texts take on their full meaning, and from those who are involved in a variety of capacities in our practice. All this does not exclude your obtaining from me answers that I will be in a position to give you. It would be particularly appreciated if everyone were to give, according to his or her resources, his or her utmost in contributing to this new phase of the seminar. Your utmosts consist in not replying with a long face, saying it
just so happens that this week you are particularly heavy burdened. When I call upon one or the other of you and consign a specific segment of our common task to him or her, I am talking here to those who are part of the psychoanalytic group that we represent. I would like you to realize that if it is constituted as such as an autonomous group, it is for a task that for each of us brings with it nothing less than the future, the meaning of everything which we do, and we have to do for the rest of our lives. If you are not coming to put into question everything that you do, I do not see why you are here. Why would those who do not sense the meaning of this task remain tied to us, rather than joining up with some sort of bureaucracy or other?
1. These reflections are particularly pertinent to my way of thinking, just when we are going to tackle what are commonly called Freud's papers on technique. Papers on technique is a term that a certain tradition has already fixed upon. During Freud's lifetime, a small octavo volume was published with the title Die Technik der Psychoanalyse und der Metapsychologie, which brought together a certain number of Freud's writings dating from 1904 to 1919, whose title, presentation, and contents indicated that they dealt with psychoanalytic method.
The motivation and justification for this format is that there are good grounds for cautioning an inexperienced practitioner who would like to embark upon analysis, so that he might avoid a certain number of confusions regarding the practice of the method and also regarding its essence. There are passages in these writings which are extremely important for understanding the progress that the development of practice has seen over these years. What one sees gradually appearing there are notorious fundamental to the mode of operation of the analytic therapy, the notions of resistance and function of transference, the mode of operation and the intervention in the transference, and even up to a certain point, the essential role of the transference neurosis. There is no need, then, to underline any further the quite special interest this little collection of writing possesses. To be sure, this way of bringing them together is not entirely satisfactory, and the terms paper of techniques is perhaps not only what gives it its unity. They possess no less of the unity for all that. The whole attest to a stage in the development of Freud's thought. We will study it from this perspective.
There is an intermediary step here. It follows on from the initial development of what someone, an analyst who does not always have a way with words, but who on this occasion made a rather fortunate, even beautiful, find, has called Freud's seminal experience. It antedates the elaboration of the structural theory. The footnote here says that the structural theory is just shorthand for Freud's theory of ego, id, and superego, introduced in The Ego and the Id, 1923. The beginnings of this intermediary step should be placed between 1904 and 1909. The article on the psychoanalytic method appeared in 1904 in Freud's Psychoanalytic Procedure. Some say that this is where the word psychoanalysis first appears, which isn't true, since Freud has used it well before. But what matters is that it is there used in a formal manner, in the very title of the article. 1909, the date of the lectures at Clark University, Freud's journey to America, accompanied by his son, Young. If we pick up the thread again in the year 1920, we find the theory of the agencies, the structural, or the metapsychological theory, as Freud called it. That is another theoretical development which he bequeathed to us out of his experience and his discovery. As you see, the so-called papers on technique are spread between these two advances. It is what gives them their meaning. It is a mistake to think that they owe their unity to the fact that Freud discusses technique in them. In a certain sense, Freud never ceased discussing technique. I only have to remind you of the Studien über Hysterie, or Hysterie Studien, the study of mass hysteria, I believe. Über comes to have quite a few different meanings, which is nothing other than one long account of the discovery of the analytic technique. That is where we witness it in the making, and that is what makes these studies priceless. If we wanted to give a complete and systematic account of the development of Freud's technique, we would have to start with them. I have not taken up the Studien über Hysterie for the simple reason that they are not easily accessible, since not all of you read German, nor even English, to be sure. And there are more reasons than just those of expediency leading me to choose instead the papers on technique. The interpretation of dreams is itself always endlessly about technique. If we put to one side what he wrote on mythological, anthropological, and cultural topics, hardly any of Freud's work fails to tell us something about technique. I do not need to emphasize that an article like Analysis Terminable and Interminable, which appeared around 1934, is one of the most important on technique. I would now like to stress what, in my opinion, is the best frame of mind in which to conduct our commentary on these papers this term. This is a matter that should be settled today. I'm not sure if the different translations give different sections to this, but this is how this has been sectioned. So that speech, the beginning of the seminar, was just called 1 after the overture, and now we are on to 2, which lasts for 3 to 4 pages, and then we get to number 3. And I believe these are just the best way to, or at least this is the way that this edition and translation has decided to section up the seminar, so that it's not just one large chunk, but so that with each number comes a point to be made. And if this was point 1, if it's saying anything specific to point 1, it would be that why are we discussing specifically Freud's papers on technique? And also what even is the Freud's papers on technique, as opposed to a specific text. Many of his specific texts, or some of his papers which don't cover technique per se, or specifically, although Lacan says that Freud's never not talking about technique, but some of the stuff which enters into Freud's metapsychological theories, or the parts of Freud which start to delve into a much more, not necessarily conspirational, not necessarily, a little bit where Freud even himself starts to get stuck in his own developments, where he starts to get speculative, I suppose would be a good word. Which, beyond the pleasure principle, for instance, Freud starts to come up with some concepts that he himself is not very sure of and not too happy with, such as his response to trauma, which is what Beyond the Pleasure Principle is probably mostly about, if anything. The death drive, the death instinct, and the nirvana principle. Why do we repeat those things which we don't enjoy? Why do we repeat those things which are most horrible to us, which completely negates the logic of the pleasure principle? But here Lacan wants to tell us that we want to talk about technique, which refers to transference and analysis. In the psychoanalytic session, you come to find that all theory of psychoanalysis is for praxis, and Lacan keeps this the same case. He is a psychoanalyst. He wants to look at Freud and psychoanalysis to retrieve it, and so that it can be used to make practice of it. So where better to begin than with the techniques of psychoanalysis? Point 2. If we are under the impression that we are here to stand back in admiration of the Freudian texts and marvel at them, we will certainly be well satisfied. The freshness and the vivacity of these papers is not surpassed by any of Freud's other writings. At times, his personality is revealed in them in so direct a manner that one cannot fail to remark it. The simplicity and the frankness of tone are in and of themselves a kind of education. More specifically, the ease with which the question of practical rules to be observed is dealt with shows us the extent to which they were for Freud an instrument, in the sense that one says one has a hammer firmly in hand. Firmly held by this hand of mine, he says in short, and this is how I am accustomed to holding it. Others may possibly prefer a marginally different instrument which sits better in their hand. You will come across passages that will tell you that far more clearly than I do in this metaphorical way. So the codification of rules of technique is dealt with in these papers with a freedom which in and of itself might well be a sufficient education, and even on a first reading bears fruits and yields its rewards. There is nothing more wholesome and liberating, and nothing demonstrates more clearly that the real issues lies elsewhere. But that's not all. In the manner in which Freud communicates to us what we would call the paths of the truth of his thought, there is quite a different aspect to be discovered in those passages which may perhaps appear of secondary importance, but which are nonetheless quite perceptible. It is the long-suffering side of his personality, the feeling he has of the necessity of authority, which in his case is not without a certain fundamental depreciation of what anyone who has something to communicate or teach can expect from those who listen to and follow him. In many a place we come across a measure of profound contempt for the manner in which these things are made use of and understood. As you will see, I even believe that one finds him in a very specific disparagement of the human raw material made available to him by the society in which he lived. Undoubtedly, this is what allows us to catch a glimpse of why Freud, in contrast to what happens in his writings, mobilized the full weight of his authority so as to assure, so he believed, the future of analysis. He both excluded all manner of doctrinal dissensions, quite real dissensions, which emerged, and at the same time was quite imperious as to what could be organized around him as the means for the transmission of his teaching. All this is only a glimpse of what this reading reveals of the historical aspects of Freud's activity and presence. Are we going to restrict ourselves to this level? Certainly not. If only because it would be quite ineffectual, despite the interest and the stimulation, the amusement and relaxation that we might expect from it. It is always in relation to the question, what do we do when we do analysis? That up to now I have offered this commentary of Freud. The scrutiny of these short papers will be undertaken in the same spirit. Hence my starting point is the current state of technique. What is said, written, and done concerning analytic technique. I don't know if most of you, I hope at least some, are fully aware of the following fact. When I am referring to the present, 1954, this brand new year, we examine now the manner in which the diverse practitioners of analysis think, express, conceive of their technique. We conclude that things have come to such a pass that it would not be an exaggeration to call it the most radical confusion. I can tell you that right now, amongst those who are analysts and who think, which already limits the field, there isn't perhaps a single one who deep down has the same conception as any other of his contemporaries or peers as to what one does, what one aims to do, what one achieves, and what is going on in analysis. It has even got to the point where we could amuse ourselves with a little game of comparing the most extreme conceptions. We would see that they arrive at formulations which are strictly contradictory, without even seeking out those who cherish paradoxes. Anyhow, there aren't that many of them. The question is of such import that the various theoreticians tackle it with no inclination to whimsicality and humour in general, is excluded from their laborious pontifications on therapeutic results, their forms, their procedures, and the means by which one obtains them. They content themselves with hanging onto a balustrade, to a guardrail offered by some corner or another of Freud's theoretical system. This alone gives each of them the guarantee that he is still communicating with those who are his fellow analysts and colleagues. The Freudian language acts as the go-between by which a channel of communication is kept open between practitioners who hold two manifestly different conceptions of their therapeutic activity, and, what is more, of the general form of this interhuman relation called psychoanalysis. When I say interhuman relations, you can already see that I am describing things the way they are today. Indeed, the elaboration of the notion of the relation between analyst and analysand is the path taken by the contemporary analytic doctrines in trying to rediscover a firm basis for the realities of that experience. Certainly it represents the most fertile line of thought traced out since Freud's death. Belint calls it a two-body psychology, a term which in fact is not his, which he borrowed from the late Rickman, one of the rare souls to have had a modicum of theoretical originality in analytic circles since Freud's death. Around this formula one may quite easily align all studies on object relations, on the importance of countertransference, and on a certain set of related terms, amongst which fantasy stands in the foreground. The imaginary interreaction between analysand and analyst is thus something we shall have to take into consideration. Does this mean that this is the way to locate our problem precisely? On the one hand, yes. On the other, no. It is very worthwhile to stimulate research of this character inasmuch as it highlights the originality of what is at stake when compared to a one-body psychology, the conventional constructive psychology. But is it sufficient to say that we are dealing with a relation between two individuals? It is in this way that we are brought to recognize the impasses into which theories of technique are currently led. I am not in a position to say more to you about this for the moment, even though, as those who are old hands in this seminar know, you are obviously aware that there is no two-body psychology without the intervention of a third element. If, as we must, we take speech as the central feature of our perspective, then it is within a free rather than a two-term relation that we have to formulate the analytic experience in its totality. See John Rickman's Selected Contributions to Psychoanalysis, Methodology and Research in Psychopathology, Number and the Human Sciences. See also Makar Belint on Love and Hate, In Primary Love and Psychoanalytic Technique. And Belint's phrase is two-person psychology, English in the original. Continuing. Which doesn't mean to say that we cannot express fragments, pieces, and tail ends of it in other registers. In that way, you can grasp the kind of obstacles the theoreticians have come up against. It's really very easy to understand if the foundation of the inter-analytic relation is truly something that we are obliged to represent as being triadic. You can put the accent on one or other of the three dyadic relations that are set up within it. As you will see, this furnishes a practical means of classifying a certain number of theoretical elaborations concerning technique that have been proposed. Point 2. What was that about? A couple of things. Critique and analysis of the contemporary situation for psychoanalysis. Since we are discussing the development and the history of psychoanalysis, or the historicity of analysis since Freud, we must also, and Lacan does here, bring us back to where is psychoanalysis now? And if we're talking about the history of psychoanalytic technique, what's to be said about psychoanalytic technique today? And what is being said, Lacan says, is contradictory and paradoxical. No one's too sure, or everyone's so sure, and yet everyone is saying completely different things. So what must come to be perused and assessed and analysed is not just the historicity of technique, but where it stands today, and vice versa, where technique stands today in representation and opposition to Freud's original contributions to understanding, analysis, and technique. And there are a few mentioned alternative views and psychologies on the matter, referring to a two-body or a two-person psychology, which I believe is referring to here the analytic relation. And this is probably the second important point of this text at this point. The relationship between analyst, the one performing the analysis, the one that you pay to perform the analysis, and the analysand, the one who is paying to have analysis done to them, but who also participates in their own analysis nevertheless. Lacan seems to prefer analysand to something like patient. I'm not too sure why. I think you can understand why, though, what patient does in terms of signifier, what kind of subjectivity that forces you into when you accept yourself and describe yourself as patient, to pay to be a patient, versus an analysand, to pay to be the person who wants to receive analysis, who wants to be analysed. And this is one of the more important points for Deleuze-Guattari too, relations and interrelations, not only between analysand and analyst, but between analysand and world, and between analyst and world. And this is also just as important for Foucault, who in History of Madness and in Biopower and in essays on biopolitics and biopower comes to describe what the serve and history of the psychoanalyst has been in terms of structure, discipline, and society. And this is no different from when Freud conceptualized in his Civilization and its Discontents that society is itself a result of repression, of discipline. It's the fact that we have complexes that are instilled in us, that are superego and morality principles instilled in us, that we have come to form what we now experience today as society, or what Freud considered a civilized society. which Deleuze and Guattari critique heavily in there. I think it's the second section of Anti-Oedipus, Barbarians and Civilized Men, which is also based on a text that heavily influenced Marx and Engels, which I cannot find, an anthropological text, much in the style of Levi Strauss, who comes before Lacan and much longer after Marx and Engels. So to continue, point 3. All this may appear to you at the moment to be a little abstract, and I want to do my best to tell you something a bit more concrete to bring you into this discussion. I am going to remind you quickly of Freud's seminal experience, which I mentioned earlier on, since in fact that is what partly the object of our lectures of last term totally centered, as they were on the notion that the complete reconstitution of the subject's history is the element that is essential, constitutive, and structural for analytic progress. I believe that I have demonstrated that that is where Freud started from. What is at issue for him is the understanding of an individual case. That is what gives each of the 5 great case histories their value. The 3 that we have already looked at, pondered over, and worked on together in previous years shows you just that. Freud's progress, the discoveries he made, lies in the way he considers the singularity of a case. So Lacan's already, in smaller essays, gone over specific individual case studies from Freud, which include Little Hans, the Rat Man, Wolf Man, and the case of a hysteric whose name I've forgotten. That's okay. That's okay. We'll come back to that. So we're starting with the seminars, seminar 1. So these have already been done. All the Lacan's 3 case studies and interpretations of Freud have already been done, and here we are getting into Lacan's formulations, the beginning of his formulations, using Freud. Consider it in its singularity. What does that mean? That means essentially that for him, Freud, the interest, the essence, the basis, the dimension proper to analysis is the reintegration by the subject of his history right up to the furthermost perceptible limits. That is to say, into a dimension that goes well beyond the limits of the individual. To lay the foundations, deduce it, demonstrate it employing 1,000 subtleties in Freud's texts, is what we have accomplished together over the last few years. What reveals this dimension is the accent that Freud puts in each case on those points that it is essential to overcome by means of the technique, and which are what I call the bearings, situations, of the history. Does this amount to placing the accent on the past, as it may appear at first sight? I showed you that it is not as simple as that. History is not the past. History is the past insofar as it is historicized in the present. Historicized in the present because it was lived in the past. The path of restitution of the subject's history takes form of a quest for the restitution of the past. We should consider this restitution as the butt to be aimed at by the recourse of technique. Throughout Freud's works, in which, as I have told you, technical suggestions are to be found at every turn, you will discover that the restitution of the past retained its prominent position in his preoccupations right to the end. That is why the very questions which are opened up by this Freud's discoveries are raised by the restitution of the past. And they turn out to be none other than the questions which up to now have been avoided, skirted around in analysis, namely those which bear on the function of time in the realization of the human subject. When we return to the origin of the Freudian experience, and when I say origin, I do not mean historical origin, but point source, one realizes that this is what has always kept analysis alive, despite the profoundly different garbs it has been given again and again. Freud emphasizes the restitution of the past, even when, with the conception of the 3 agencies, you will see that one can even talk of 4. He gives a considerable extension to the structural point of view, favoring thereby a certain orientation which will increasingly focus on the analytic relation in the present, on the here and now of the session, between the 4 walls of analysis. To back up what I'm telling you, all I need to do is cite an article he published in 1933, Construction in der Analysis, in which what is at issue again and ever is the reconstruction of the subject's history, or the constructions in analysis. You won't find a more characteristic instance of the persistence of this point of view in all of Freud's work. In this article, it is something like a final insistence on this pivotal theme. We have here something like the distilled essence, the point, the last word, and what has been at stake all along. In a work as central as The Wolfman, what value does the subject's reconstructed past have? One could say that Freud touches there, though one senses it maybe in many other places in his corpus, on a notion that was emerging in the course of our discussions last term, and which is roughly the following: the fact that the subject relives, comes to remember, in the intuitive sense of the word, the formative events of his existence, is not in itself so very important. What matters is what he reconstructs of it. On this point, there are some striking turns of phrase. After all, Freud writes, Traumdreams sind auch Erinnern, or Erinnern, are also a way of remembering. That's from the history of an infantile neurosis. He even goes so far as to say that screen memories themselves are, after all, an adequate representation of what is at issue. To be sure, in their manifest form as memories, they certainly are not. But if we work on them sufficiently, they render up to us the equivalent of what we are looking for. Can you see where this is all leading to? It leads, within Freud's own conception, to an idea that what is involved is a reading, a qualified and skilled translation of the cryptogram, representing what the subject is conscious of at the moment. What am I going to say now? Of himself? No, not only of himself. Of himself and of everything else. That is to say, the whole of his system. As I told you just a moment ago, the restitution of the subject's wholeness appears in the guise of a restoration of the past. But the stress is always placed more on the side of reconstruction than on that of reliving, in the sense we have grown used to calling affective. The precise reliving that the subject remembers something as truly belonging to him, as having truly been lived through, which he communicates and which he adopts. We have the most explicit indication in Freud's writings that that is not what is essential. What is essential is reconstruction, the term he employs right up until the end. And there is something truly remarkable here, which would be paradoxical if we gained access to it without having an awareness of the meaning it may take on in the register of speech, which I am trying here to highlight as being necessary to the understanding of our experience. I would say, when all is said and done, it is less a matter of remembering than of rewriting history. I tell you what there is in Freud. That doesn't imply that he was right. But this thread is continuous, permanently subjacent to his thought's development. He never abandons something with which he can only be put in the way I found of saying it, rewriting history, a formula which allows one to put in perspective the various directions that he gives apropos of the little details in the narratives within analysis. End of point 3. What is Lacan saying here then, boys and girls? MBs, gender fluids, agenders, wolf gods, gods among us. What's important here, some terms like screen memory, the idea of the construction of the subject himself. Screen memory is a term that Freud employs to describe the kind of memory that a subject or patient has, which doesn't necessarily, as Freud suggests, doesn't necessarily reflect the past as such, but reflects something with which the subject themselves have created out of the past. Which is to say, it isn't the past, but it is using certain materials from lived experience, from history, from the subject's history, to constitute the subject's relation to it. That's a lot of words, I apologize. Screen memories are false memories, but they're not fabricated totally. They have a point of origin, as was said in this text. It's not so much that they are invented, or that they originate, but that they have points of origin, and this is something very core to the concept of Nietzsche's genealogy. When is a thing's origin? What is a thing's origin? Which is so much to say, actually, what is a thing's invention? Its points of invention. Foucault is a wonderful lecture on this that hopefully we'll get to read soon. And so for technique, the case isn't then discovering the subject's history, but discovering the history for the subject, how they construct their own history and construct themselves out of it, how they reconstruct and rewrite history rather than relive it. And this is very, very, very important for a reading of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, one of the final texts, one of the most important texts. Not to relive trauma, so to speak, because that's exactly what Freud is seeing in cases of what's called shell shock, what's now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. After the war, after both World War I and World War II, and during World War II, cases of what we would call repetition compulsion before we call it the death drive, but they're closely linked. The need and the compulsion to repeat, to relive experience, and not necessarily good experience, but to relive even those traumas, those experiences of life that we desperately want to avoid, which is the paradox in the subject. The very things we try to avoid are the very things that we can't help but relive. Something that Jung also formulates in the form of the shadow. The very things which we repress in the unconscious that then either possess us, take over us, or which we project into the world. By repressing it, we can't help but see it everywhere, or by repressing it, we can't help but let it take over us. Psychoanalysis is fun, but critiques of psychoanalysis are just as fun. All of this will come through. This was done in 1954, which is exactly the same year in which, on Sunday, we will be reading Deleuze's What is Grounding, 1954. So it's going to be fun to compare those two texts and the two different directions they take. Point 4. To the Freudian conception that I am expounding to you, I could counterpose completely different conceptions of the analytic experience. Certain authors maintain that analysis is a sort of homeopathic discharge by the subject of his fantasized understanding of the world. In their view, this fantasized understanding should, little by little, within the day-to-day experience taking place in the consulting room, boil down, transform itself, and achieve a new equilibrium within a given relation to the real. What is emphasized here, as you see, is in clear contrast to Freud, is the transformation of the fantasized relation in the course of a relation which one calls, without further ado, real. Certainly one can formulate these matters in a more open fashion, sufficiently nuanced to accommodate the plurality of the expression, as has been done by someone to whom I have already referred here, who has written on technique, none of which in the end stops it from coming back to that. Some peculiar repercussions thereby result, which we will be in a position to point to when we come to our commentary on the Freudian texts. How did the practice that Freud initiated get transformed into a manipulation of the analyst-and-listened relationship in the sense that I have just outlined? That's the fundamental question that we will be encountering in the course of the study we are undertaking. The ideas that Freud introduced in the period immediately after that of the papers on technique, namely those of the free agencies, were greeted, employed, and dealt with in such a way as to result in this transformation. Of the free, the ego took on the greatest importance. Since then, all subsequent development of analytic technique has revolved around the conception of the ego. And that is where we must locate the source of all the difficulties arising out of the theoretical elaborations on this development in practice. There is, without a doubt, a world of difference between what we actually do in this sort of den where the patient talks to us and where from time to time we talk to him, and the theoretical account that we give of it, even in Freud, where the gap is infinitely more narrow. We have the impression that some distance remains. I am certainly not the only one to have asked myself this question. What was Freud really doing? Weigler asked this question in plain black and white, and answers that we don't really know much apart from what Freud himself allowed us to see when he himself set down, also in plain black and white, the fruits of certain of his experiences, namely his 5 great case histories. They are the best introduction we have to the manner in which Freud behaved. But it really does seem as if the character of this experience cannot be reproduced in its concrete reality for one very simple reason, on which I have already insisted: the singularity of the analytic experience when it comes to Freud. It really was Freud who opened up this path of experience. This in itself gave him an absolutely unique perspective, as his dialogue with the patient demonstrates. As one can sense all the time, the patient is for him only a sort of prop or question, or sometimes even a check along the path that he, Freud, took alone. Hence the drama, in the true sense of the word, of his quest. The drama which in each of the cases he gave to us ends in failure. Throughout his life, Freud followed the path that he opened up in the course of this experience, attaining in the end something that one could call a promised land. One cannot say, however, that he entered into it. You need only read what can be considered to be his testament, analysis terminable and interminable, in order to see that if there was one thing that he was aware of, it was that he hadn't entered into it, into the promised land. This article isn't recommended reading for all and sundry, for anyone who knows how to read. Luckily, there are not many people who do know how to read. It is a difficult one to digest if you happen to be an analyst, and if you aren't an analyst, you don't give a toss. Which means to not care. Those who find themselves in a position to follow Freud are confronted with the question as to how the paths we inherit were adopted, reapprehended, and re-thought through. So we cannot do anything else but gather together what we will contribute to it under the heading or heading of critique. A critique of analytic technique. Technique is and can only be of any value to the extent that we understand wherein lies the fundamental question for the analyst who adopts them. Well then, we should note first of all that we hear the ego spoken of as the ally of the analyst, and not only the ally, but the sole source of knowledge. The only thing we know of is the ego. That's the way it is usually put. Anna Freud, Fenichel, nearly all of those who have written about analysis since the 1920s say it over and over again. We speak only to the ego. We are in communication with the ego alone. Everything is channeled via the ego. On the other hand, in contrast, every advance made by this ego psychology can be summed up as follows. The ego is structured exactly like a symptom. At the heart of the subject, it is only a privileged symptom. The human symptom par excellence. The mental illness of man. To translate the analytic ego in this quick and shorthand manner is at best to sum up what emerges from a straightforward reading of Anna Freud's book, The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense. One cannot avoid being struck by the fact that the ego is constructed and is to be located within the subject as a whole, just as a symptom. Nothing differentiates the one from the other. No objection can be made to this quite dazzling argument. No less dazzling is the fact that things have got so confused that the catalogue of defense mechanisms which make up the ego is as heterogeneous a list as one could conceive of. Anna Freud herself underscores this very clearly, to bring repression closer to notions such as the turning of the drive against its object, or the inversion of its aims, is to put side by side elements which are in no respect homogeneous. Heterogeneous means from unique origins, as opposed to homogeneous, which means from the same origin point. Given the point where we still find ourselves, perhaps we cannot do any better now, but we can still highlight the profound ambiguity of the conception analysts entertain of the ego, which is the only thing to which one has access, despite also being only another hindrance, a failure, an acte manque, a slip. At the start of his chapters on analytic interpretation, Fenichel speaks of the ego as, speaks of the ego as everyone does. and feels the need to say that it plays the essential role of being a function by which the subject learns the meaning of words. So from the very start then, Venechel is at the heart of the matter. Everything is there. The issue is knowing whether the meaning of the ego exceeds the self, or moi. If this function is a function of the ego, everything that follows in Venechel's account is incomprehensible. And besides, he doesn't press the point. I say that it is a slip of the pen, since it isn't pursued. And everything that goes on from there amounts to saying the opposite and leads him to the conclusion that, in the end, the id and the ego amount to exactly the same thing. Which isn't about to clarify matters, but I repeat, either the subsequent argument is unthinkable, or it is not true that the ego is the function for which the subject learns the meaning of words. The ego, what is it? What is the subject caught up in? Which is beyond the meaning of words, a completely different matter. Language, whose role is formative and quite fundamental in his history. With respect to Freud's papers on technique, we will have to ask ourselves these questions, which will take us a long way, but only on condition that it is first of all in relations to each of our experiences. It will also be incumbent upon us when we try to engage in discussions, taking as our starting point the present state of theory and technique, to ask ourselves what was already implicit in what Freud brought us, or perhaps already inclined him towards those formulae to which we are now led in our practices. What constraints might there be in the manner in which we are led to look at things? Or in what sense does something that has happened since amount to being a development, a more rigorous systematization which corresponds better to reality? This is the register within which our commentary will take on its meaning. End of point 4. Here we have been introduced in point 4, the real. For the first time, one of the key registers of experience, one of the key registers by which Lacan will come to analyze psychoanalysis itself and the subject, and the history and the philosophy of the subject. The real. Something which is a word by which Lacan believes Freud was always himself talking about, though he never said explicitly. And he'll come to say the same thing for the word signify, a word which is latent within Freud yet not present. It's there, but it's not spoken. And this comes to be why Lacan's meta-commentary on Freud is not just a reteaching, as we have just seen here, in the same way that the subject does not just relive history, but reconstructs it. This is exactly what Lacan is doing with Freud's papers on techniques. We are not reliving it, we are not just speaking it, we are reconstructing its history, reconstructing it as such. And now we are discussing another key point of the three agencies, which I've already discussed, thankfully, so I don't have to do that again. The point of the ego, and what we call ego psychology. The idea of understanding the subject in terms of ego, and purely as such. This is one of the most critical points that Lacan has as a psychoanalyst. One of the things that he critiques most as a psychoanalyst is ego psychology. And we will come to see that the ego does not very much come to represent what the subject is for Lacan. And for Lacan, the subject in every way comes to find themselves expressed in language, not by means of ego, but by means of other mechanisms. What we call the subject experiences themselves, or the subject is a signifier for another signifier. And now to start point 5. I would like to give you a still clearer sense of how I envisage this seminar. At the end of the last few lectures I delivered to you, you had a taste of a reading of what can be called the psychoanalytic myth. The direction of this reading is not so much that of criticism as of gauging the reality which confronted to, and to which it offers its mythical reply. While the problem is more restricted, but also much more pressing, where technique is concerned. Indeed, the scrutiny that we will have to engage in of everything pertaining to our technique falls within the purview of our own discipline. If we have to differentiate the actions and the behavior of the subject from what he says to us about them in the session, I would say that our actual behavior in the analytic session is just as much far from the theoretical account that we give of it. But this is only a first truth, which only has significance insofar as it may be reversed and at the same time mean just as close. The fundamental absurdity of interhuman behavior can only be comprehended in the light of this system, as Melanie Klein so happily called it, another psychoanalyst and psychologist of the time. Klein psychoanalysis and a different development. Freud and Lacan come to have a few specific debates and critiques that we hopefully look at some point. Not knowing as usual what she was saying, called the human ego, namely that set of defenses, of denials, negations, of dams, of inhibitions, of fundamental fantasies which orient and direct the subject. Well then, the theoretical conception we have of our technique, even if it doesn't coincide exactly with what we are doing, doesn't structure any the less, or motivate any the less, the least of our interventions with the said patients. And this is precisely what is so serious, because we have effectively allowed ourselves, in the sense revealed to us by analysis, in which we allow ourselves things without knowing it, to bring our ego into play in the analysis, since it is argued that one is trying to bring about the patient's readaptation to the real. One really ought to find out if it is the analyst's ego which offers the measure of the real. To be sure, it isn't enough to have a definite conception of ego for our ego to come into play like a bull in the china shop of our relation to the patient. But a certain way of conceiving of the function of the ego in analysis does have some relation to a certain practice of analysis that we might well call inauspicious. I am only opening up the question. It is our task to resolve it. The totality of each of our world systems, I am referring to the concrete system which doesn't have to be already spelled out for it to be there, which does not pertain to the order of the unconscious, but which acts in the manner in which we express ourselves in daily life, in the smallest spontaneous detail of our discourse. Is that something which must in actual fact, yea or nay, be employed in analysis as the yardstick? I think we have opened up the question sufficiently for you to now see the point of what we can do together. Manoni, will you get together with one of your neighbors, and you, for instance, to study the notion of resistance in those of Freud's writings available to you under the title On Psychoanalytic Technique, published by Presses Universitaires? Don't overlook the concluding lectures of the introductory lectures. Will two others, Perrier and Granoff, for instance, collaborate on the same topic? Then we will see how to proceed. We will let ourselves be guided by experience itself. End of part 1. Damn, son. What was that about? I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. Too crazy for me. Too wild. This is well outside of my purview. Far outside of my ballpark. Well, I'm just going to have to make some guesses then. The psychoanalytic myth. What was that referring to? A taste of the reading of what can be called the psychoanalytic myth. Well, there are a couple, and I think being that Lacan had a very specific contribution to make in the last point about the ego, I cannot help but believe that he is referring to both the myth of Oedipus, one of the most important for Freud's theories, and the myth of ego, which come together to make very much the same triadic point that the ego is formulated out of Oedipus necessarily by means of the Oedipus complex, by means of castration, by means of the no other father, by means of relation to the mother, and the ego itself is a construct of psychoanalysis, a thing of psychoanalysis, a myth of psychoanalysis. And so whilst we are discussing psychoanalysis in terms of the ego, and we will be doing the same ego in terms of psychoanalysis, we will also be critiquing that idea as such. The idea that maybe psychoanalysis has gone too far in its construction of the ego, that it relies on itself too much, relies on its own myths too much to see and to actually analyze itself, which was always the kind of aim of psychoanalysis, very much so self-analysis, and that's why most of Freud's papers are about him personally, especially interpretations of dreams. That whole thing is about what Freud's dreams and not just his patients, but much so his own relations to his own unconscious. So how do we conceive of a psychoanalytic system which doesn't privilege the ego as a myth, and as more than a myth, as a formulation and formation of the subject themselves? And how do we do this? Lacan says we have to now introduce a new concept, a concept which helps us align the ego to something other than itself, which we will call the real. The real, the new yardstick, he goes on to say, or perhaps, or at least if the ego was the yardstick of psychoanalysis hitherto, then perhaps the new yardstick in Lacanian psychoanalysis will then be the real, as opposed to the ego. And what is the real? Well, we'll get into that when we... Hopefully Lacan will take us through what he means when he says the real. And in the 70s, he comes to say that it's the only thing that he ever speaks of. And at the same time, what does he say on television? I always tell the truth. Not the whole truth, because it is impossible. But it is this very impossibility which gives truth to language. The language of the real. The real is then that which cannot be spoken. It is the impossibility in language, but it's the very impossibility of language itself which gives function and meaning to language. And this is something that will be explored much further. And this is where we also have the philosophical debate within Lacan of a Kantian real, a transcendental, almost Platonic world of forms, of essences, where things truly are the case in themselves, such as the das Ding an sich, the thing in itself, or what we would call the Hegelian dialectical notion, or the materialist notion, the Hegelian one being the conception of spirit out of Descartes' cogito and Kant's thing in itself, which is to say there's not so much a noumenal world out there of essence by which we can judge all things, the very truth and matter of fact of it all, the very realness of it all, but that this very realness is constructed out of fantasy, out of arbitrariness, and out of that which we would call not real or fictional. That what is real is contingent, structured, and constantly changing. And the materialist notion is kind of a reversal of this then, that if there is something at play in human consciousness that gives life to the material world, that which Hegel calls spirit, that which we call phenomenology des Geistes, at least the phenomenology of spirit and the phenomenology of mind, how mind comes to construct itself through forms and ideas. Marx wants to say actually it is much more so that there is first of all the material, social reality, and then consciousness constructs itself and develops itself out of this. History isn't an idea, but a ground of materials which gives rise to ideas, which then inform history, which then informs the ideas, and thus the dialectic continues. And since that's the end of part one, I wonder, I'm going to quickly check to see that the bot is still recording, but I wonder if anyone has any questions about Lacan and about the seminars and about what we've just read, because I'd be very happy to spend a minute to just go over questions for the time being.
Okay, so I'd just like to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. Can you hear me? Okay, so what I'm understanding here is that during the analysis, there is no two-body psychology because speech is always the third element. It's through speech, constitution of the subject is possible, but here, what we mean by subject is not the ego, rather the unconscious, and so with speech we can sort of like create something new through remembrance of the past, and that just hits the real. I don't know if I'm understanding.
Yeah, so, oh sorry, I hope I can give you a good answer to this. So, Lacan is definitely coming to critique this idea of the two-body psychology, of the two-body problem, as we could call it, in analysis, which means that you can read psychoanalysis in terms of just transference and counter-transference, right? There you are the analysant, here I am the analyst. You are constructed not just by yourself, but also by me. And Lacan says that it's not him, but someone else who introduces this idea then of a free-bodied problem, that it's not just you, the analyst, and me, the analysant, but also this always a third term, which we could call language itself, or we could call the outside, or what Lacan then begins to bring in notions of stuff like the big other, and the small other, and also stuff like the Oedipal complex. But in the overture to the seminar, he says something very specific about the ego. He says that it's like an empty egg. And very much like the idea that Deleuze and Guattari come to make up the body without organs, we come to see that even Lacan has problems with the idea of the third term, because that necessarily implies that all the terms are there to begin with, that there really is a you there as a whole being, an analyst there as a whole being who represents what we could call realness, the measure of reality itself, and that there is an outside to all this. Lacan wants to blend all of these systems together to say that actually these are all just one. He uses the term monist earlier, a monist conception that actually it's just a one body, your body, my body, the outside body. They all come to be the same thing. They all come to be expressions of one big body. But then at the same time, we have to recognize that all this oneness, this monist approach, doesn't represent very well the fragmentations within it. If this is all one big-bodied problem, then why are you separate from me, and why are we both separate from the world? Why is it that in this session of analysis, within the four walls of analysis, Lacan says, am I experiencing a relation with you? But when I go outside of the analysis, once I finish analysis and I go back out into the world, what am I experiencing now? And oh, sorry, I'm going on a little bit only because this is a good question that I myself want to really understand better for myself. The work of analysis that I am told is not in interpretation. It's not actually in the session what you could call the work of analysis. In the session, you're interpreting language, you're trying to understand the meanings behind signifiers, much like how one interprets dreams. But this is not where any work happens. Work happens, or the technique that we're going through here, the techniques of Freud are not where the work is, not where results are. But these are the techniques to achieving the results, which always occur outside of the session, when the subject or the analysand goes outside, and once again, they escape the two-body psychology and go back out into the world, where they experience all different forms of body psychology, between one and several, between one as several, between one as the world, between them and their parents, between them and God, between like them and all the different versions of themselves that belong within them. And Lacan is then having to say, well, here we are, and he's asked his students at the end of this point one to do this. Here we are with this problem. Two-body doesn't do it. Free-body doesn't do it. In fact, ego doesn't do it. We're finding resistances and problems at all of these different sites of communication, at all these different sites of interpretation. So what are we going to have to do? What are we going to do to try and get beyond these problems? How are we going to conceive of psychoanalytic technique to take into consideration both this monist conception, that it's not two or three, but always one, but at the same time, how this one is almost infinitely fragmented and differentiated within itself, like a big piece of pie cut up into several different, slices. A pie is still one whole pie, but it can be cut into different slices. Each slice is unique and individual, yet still constitutes and make up the whole of the pie. That's how a monist conception or monist framework works, especially in Spinoza's conception in the Ethics. Where we refer to God or nature as this infinite singular substance, which comes to express itself in thought or an extension, which are still expressions of the same thing, but are in themselves unique of the same thing, which is a bit hard to explain, but Spinoza's Ethics is hard to explain anyway. But it's very important to get what Lacan's getting at here. I hope that helps. Sorry. I hope that does something. Yeah. Oh, hello. Yes, please. We have a good minute to ask some questions.
Yeah, hello, Cody. I'm at work, so I only got like 10 minutes before I have to end the stream.
No, that's fine.
But anyways, I was thinking about in what way does like the real...
I just want to understand,
Oh, sorry.
when he talks about the realization of the subject, what does he mean by the subject? It doesn't mean the ego. Is it the subject of the unconscious?
Oh, this is something that we'll have to develop. How we're going to construct the conception. Sorry, I'll get back to you, Kenny Booker. I know you got work. I'll get back to you on this because then you can follow up from this question. We are now talking about this whole point of psychoanalysis is to discuss what the subject is. And Lacan gets upset because psychoanalysis got itself stuck on the ego, that the subject is ego and comes to be represented by the ego. So what we're now doing, and what Lacan is asking of us in reading Freud's papers on techniques and of his students, is to go, well, then how can we constitute the subject if we aren't constituting it by way of the ego? And this is why we now have to talk about the real. And as we've said, and as Lacan goes on to say, and to continue to develop throughout the seminars, when we talk about the real, we are going to fundamentally find resistances at every point. And the same should be said for the subject. Every time we try to define the subject by means of ego, by means of Heidegger's Dasein, by means of Deleuze and Guattari's body without organs, we're going to necessarily hit a resistance that doesn't fully quite get it. Because whenever we talk about it, we also talk about ourselves and our relation to it, which is itself changing, which can never itself be fully expressed in language. Sorry, I hope that helps. So thank you, though. Yeah, you got work, so hit me with the questions. I'll try and answer you as quickly as I can.
Yeah, that was a good answer. But anyway, I was just like thinking before I go back, I don't know if this comes up probably later, but in what way does like the real differ from Kant's the thing in itself?
Goddamn, what a philosophical question. What a good question. In what way does Lacan's real?
Maybe it's relevant maybe later. Maybe it's relevant maybe later.
I would say it only itself comes up specifically in Lacan. He does come to talk about this specifically much, much later. I'm talking like after seminar 15. But there's nothing wrong with this, because everything that you'll come to find later on in the seminars you should always try and retroactively insert it back into the original seminars. I mean, Lacan's always developing his own ideas. He's always going back on himself. He's always going, I know I said this back in seminar 4, but ignore that. Get rid of that, and I want to start fresh. And he does this all the time because he thinks that Freud himself never does this. He says this earlier in this seminar that Freud's quite self-critical, and he'll use terms that he struggles with, but only because those terms relate to problems that need solutions. So whilst he might not be so happy with the solution, he needs the problem. He finds the problem to be essential, and that's why he continues to use terms that aren't so well defined, like death drive, like nirvana principle, even though that they themselves are very speculative. The problems are very real and grounded. And Lacan wants to do the opposite here. He wants to say, whilst we may use terms to refer to problems, we are happy to completely get rid of terms and create entirely new terms if we can more closely define what the problem is. Only in using good solutions, by terms of good words and good signifiers, can we actually come to define what the real problems are. The real comes to be the problem as such. All problems are problems at the level of the real. Otherwise, they aren't real problems. They're only symbolic or imaginary problems, which we will get to discover more. But now we're talking about the real all the time. How is the real different from Kant's Das Ding? Is because you can actually quite well define Das Ding, the thing in itself, Das Ding an sich. You can define it as Das Ding. It simply means essence in itself, pure essence. It's that which gives rise to the categories of experience, what we call phenomenological experience. This is the Kantian split between noumena, the transcendental, which means that which is beyond perception, that which is beyond perceptibility, phenomenability. Phenomena just means that which can be perceived. Noumena is the stuff behind perception. I can only try and explain this briefly and quickly, sorry, because it's Kantian metaphysics and it's easy to get stuck up in it, and the whole point of continental philosophy as such is responding to Kant. So I mean, I'm glad that you asked it, because it's one of the points that I will be talking about probably the most. Lacan in terms of Kant, and then later in terms of Hegel and how Hegel responds to Kant. The noumena is... Oh, okay. Sorry, yeah. I'm glad that you asked. I'm sure that you already know this. I'm just doing this for the sake of the recording for people that want to know a good answer to this question, what we actually mean by this.
Yeah, sure.
If noumena, the transcendental, is the stuff, the essence is behind things, they're the stuff that we can't perceive but gives rise to perception itself, then it presents itself as it's called Das Ding. It means the thing, which means that it has a kind of positive quality to it. It has a positive nature. Although we can't perceive it, it is there. That's the point of Kant and his reading of Plato's forms and what we call idealism. It's out there. We can say it's out there, noumena, the transcendental logic, the categories, etc., but we can't access it. It's inaccessible. It's transcendent. The real, however, is it's not positive. It's not a thing. Lacan comes to differentiate between Das Ding and Das Sach. I'm not very good at German, of Das Sach or Das Sach, which means the little thing, not the big thing, the big universal thing, but the little gross thing, not the big essence which shapes stuff, but the little form that essence takes. It's not take a glass or an object like a table. That Sting would be, as Plato would try and forms in the forms, it'd be the perfection of the table, the essence of the table, the higher form of which all tables relate back to, what we call the universal. But das is the particular. It's the one table that you're seeing in that moment. It's the one thing that you're referring to. This comes to more closely show us the relation that Lacan has between Kant's transcendental and the real, and which Zizek implores for us to read through a more Hegelian as opposed to a Kantian reading. Which is to say that it isn't out there inaccessible. The real isn't inaccessible. It's the very grounds of experience itself. But it does so by means of negativity. It is itself a fundamental lack. To experience noumena, if you could experience transcendental, it would be sublime. It would be like experiencing God. It would be experiencing perfection and essence. But experiencing the real is traumatic. You don't experience it as a positive feature in your life. You experience it as pure negativity. That means you experience it as the breakdown of your reality as such. You experience it as loss. It's not something gained, a pure positive feature which gives life to things. It is the very core of life which introduces death. It's a very, very, very sticky concept. It's one that we will be encountering the most throughout Lacan's seminars, and it will be in relation to Kant a lot, and it will also be in relation to a lot of other ideas, like Henri Bergson, the metaphysician who came around in France before Lacan, who also stopped Einstein getting the Nobel Prize for his theory of relativity. His notion of duration, which is in opposition to a concept like time. Duration is a completely radically metaphysical concept for the subject and how they experience time and what time is. And Hegel's conception of spirit, which is essentially noumena immanized. Noumena of this. My friend Cosper tells me it's kind of like you have a philosophy of the sky, of things above, and you have a philosophy of the ground, of dirt, and of experienceable things. And it's going to be a constant debate that we have and that Lacan has with his students, with himself in the seminars, of what the real is and how we can describe it. Should we use Kantian terms and Kantian quote-unquote metaphysics, although it is entirely a critique of metaphysics itself, just like what Hume is doing? Or do we read it through Hegel, which Zizek implores us to do, which Todd McGowan implores us to do? Or do both of these readings fail? And I believe this is the one we want to look at the most. Where does Kant fail the real, and where does Hegel fail the real? Where Zizek believes Lacan does something completely different, completely radically different. So the real comes to be its own yardstick now. It comes to be its own measure. You can definitely be referring to Kant and Das Ding and positive essences, and you can be referring to Hegel and the dialectic, how universal positive essences come to be constituted by negativity, blah, 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 blah. And also at the same time, something else, something which necessarily, and this is the most important point for the real, it's that which resists symbolization. It's that which resists language. It's that which is always at once outside of language and yet constitutes it completely. It's both completely within and paradoxically completely outside. I hope that helps. I hope paradox helps. It doesn't usually, but I hope that helps to make some sense of the Kantian framework.
Yeah, it cleared up a lot, man. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
No worries.
It cleared up a lot. Like. Okay, I gotta go back to work. Have a great stream. Looking forward to the Deleuze stream.
See you.
Okay, see you.
Have fun at work. So, any other questions then before we? I might. Yeah, I know what. I'm happy to finish that part one and to leave it at that. But I'm also happy to stay and talk for a few more minutes if you have any other questions or if you just want to discuss something. I've got 15 more minutes, so yeah, make use of me and make use of my time. Or if not, we can finish up. I'm absolutely fine either way.
I just want to ask you something. With the analyst, if we have to avoid analyst being another ego in the room, what is the analyst presented as? Is he the big other? Is he like the other? Why do we need the analyst if he's not an ego? See another subject? I just want to make...
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I do apologize because this is only something that this is a problem that we have now found, that Lacan in this seminar is telling us that we've now found, that we're saying, so if the ego doesn't come to represent the subject anymore, what comes to fill that space? What else can we think of in terms of it? And this is why it's a bit of a problem to say.
The analyst. If the analyst is not another ego in the room, does he present himself as another subject?
Yeah.
The other?
Exactly. This is exactly what we need to define, and what the next 20 seminars at least will come to define. The big other, the small other, objet petit a, the discourse. If we're not talking about the ego anymore and we're talking about language itself, what does the analyst represent? And this is the question of psychoanalysis itself. What is the analyst? And this is why we have the term real here. Is the analyst pointing to, or the measure of, something real? And if we look at it in terms of ego psychology, we would say, well, yeah, you have the subject, you have the analysand, who's just an ego that's poorly developed. They have weak defense mechanisms, they're experiencing resistances, but the analyst is a clean ego. They're a pure ego. They don't experience resistance, and they help the patient to understand their own resistances and to overcome them. Lacan doesn't like this. Lacan doesn't like this at all. And this is definitely one view that ego psychology and that American psychoanalysis tends to have for psychoanalysis. That you have a broken ego and the analyst who is a constituted ego, and they have a session together, and the constituted one helps the broken one get back together. They go back out into the world, and they're much better now. But what did in the overture, and I have to repeat this because this is the most difficult one. This is the most difficult term that I think the Losing Guattari really helped, but I'm biased here, really biased. So you have to keep that in mind when I say this. That he says that the ego is like an empty egg. That it has a shape, that it gestates, that it is full of potentiality, it is full of intensities, it is full of shapes and forms that are yet to express themselves. So that is to say, the subject is not just something which comes to relate to itself in terms of language, that which we call the ego. It's not just that which makes meaning. It's also that which escapes meaning, and also that which creates meaning at the same time. It can both destroy meaning and create meaning. The subject is not just the ego, but also the other. And the analyst, in the same sense, is not just the ego, but also their own id, their own superego, and also to themselves and other. And then we'll get this idea that Jung tries to develop, that Lacan finds quite useful too, the idea of a collective or cultural or social unconscious, that the Losing Guattari also develop in their idea of the body without organs. That we are not just experiencing subjectivity on a unique and individual level, but that subjectivity also exists between us. It's not just, analysis is not just a relation between two egos, but it's also a relation of that ego with itself, and with the outside of the egos, and with all the things that constitute it, with language, with society, with repression, with structure. It's going to be quite difficult to say exactly what it is that we should say instead of ego, which I feel like is what is kind of the answer that you might be looking for, the kind of question that you might really be asking, that you're asking here. What does the analyst come to represent then, if not an ego, if an other? And what does an other mean then, if not just another ego? And this is scary stuff. This is scary stuff for us anyway. This is the problem and we have to begin here with Descartes and the idea of solipsism, and the idea of the cogito, which is perhaps the most radical and beginning point for defining even what the subject is and also what the ego is. The cogito, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. What Descartes shows to us, or what he tries to show to us with his idea of radical skepticism, is that whilst we can be certain as well of our own existence as a thinking subject. This perhaps is probably one of the better terms we can understand of ego. Ego is the thinking subject, not the parts of the subject which exist outside of thought, what we call the unconscious, because this is where the superego and id are here, but the ego is the thinking subject. But the thinking subject can only experience their own thoughts. Phenomenologically, they can only experience themselves. And so, whilst they can be certain of their own experience, they cannot say the same about others, because they don't have others' experience within them. But so when they go out into the world and they see another person, they cannot with certainty say that that's another subject, another thinking subject. That is something that they just have to assume. But it's also something that you could say you could assume otherwise. Some people do. We call this a trait of psychopathy or apathy, to go out into the world and see others not as subjects in themselves, not as thinking subjects, but as objects, as thoughtless subjects, as purely unconscious, or as another term in philosophy is as a philosophical zombie. Just a thing. It may look like it's conscious, and it may look like it's representing consciousness, but it isn't conscious. And we say the same thing about new forms of AI and learning machines and algorithm bots that can come to make conversation and express language, whilst at the same time not having what we can say subjectivity and consciousness. And it's very much, it's not, I have to go into such detail, sorry, and I have to blabber on a little bit, because it's not just a psychoanalytic question, but it's exactly one of the things that makes Lacan very much so a philosophical and anti-philosophical thinker. Because the subject is perhaps one of the most core philosophical questions that we have. And in order to embrace it, we can't stay within the realms of psychoanalysis. This is what Lacan's telling us. Psychoanalysis fails to define the subject and to find, even itself, out of its confusion, new terms to replace the ego. And trust me, some people tried. Some people really did try to find new terms. So we use terms like moi and self, or I, and so on and so on. But this is the field of what we call ontology. I'm not saying that you don't really know this. I'm just saying this for the sake of the recording and for others who would like to make sense of this question and how to answer it. But am I right in saying that you would like to now know much more so what terms we should use to replace ego then, if we have a problem with ego? Sorry, I can keep going, but I just want to make sure that I have got that. Is that the question? Is that right? That you would like new terms?
Yes. I think
Okay.
I would elaborated more on other perspectives.
Sorry, yes, you're awfully quiet. Sorry, but I'm assuming it's because it's quite late for you or something.
No, it's that my English isn't that good. So I'm
No,
struggling.
your English is fine. Sorry, it's absolutely fine. I can hear everything you're saying. Sorry, it's just quiet.
I got an answer to my question, but I think it's way more complicated and it needs a more elaborated answer. I hope that it will be
Yeah.
answered in the text.
It is complicated. Sorry. I wish I could undercomplicate it, but that would
That would
undervalue
make
the
it
question. It's the whole point almost. We should never have an answer for this question. What do I represent to myself? Because this is a question that necessarily requires language, and this once again brings us back to the ego, which, as we're now understanding here, relates to itself via language, through the means of language, and so does the other. The other can only be a relation to a self and a subject, and we do want to say that whilst all these points and these terms have significance, especially in the history of psychoanalysis, for Freud, for philosophy, what Lacan wants to introduce here is a radical questioning. This question that you ask is a Lacanian question. And that term I find useful because when I say Lacanian question, I essentially mean a question that doesn't really have an answer. And it's a question that only answers itself through more questioning. It's a question that ends up having only more points of resistance and contention. But in these points of contention, we give birth to and we arise new terms, or what we call neologisms, new words altogether. And Lacan doesn't want to fill this gap for us. He doesn't want to say, use this instead, use big other instead. That's not the point of that. The point is to say these terms that he does create only point to black holes. They only refer to contentions. They refer to points in language where we fail and where we can only go much, much, much further. These points of failure in language, the failure to constitute a subject, and that's Heidegger's entire project too, a return to ontology and to a way of describing being itself, or Sein und Zeit, being in time. A subject is now a being towards death. A subject is Dasein, a subject is existence, a subject is in the world, blah, blah, blah. That's what Heidegger's doing. Lacan's going, that's good. That's a good way of describing what constitutes a subject, especially in our case of now having problems with the ego. But I want to go further. I want to keep radically questioning the ethics, the usefulness, the realness of these definitions in coming to define the subject and what a subject is. For me, I believe, and this is again my huge bias, that if we want new terms to define subjectivity, we need new philosophy. We can't rely on the history of Western philosophy because that is what constructed Freud's thought. Freud relied on bits of German idealism. He relies on myth, lots of myth. Psychoanalysis relies on myth all the time, and he relies on Greek philosophy. And for me, rather than Heidegger and the phenomenologists like Merleau-Ponty and Husserl and Heidegger and Hegel, who are also always talking about what is consciousness, what is subjectivity, for me, the culmination of new terms, new ways of seeing this perspective of what is the subject and the ego, what is the analyst to them, how did they relate to each other, how did these two then relate to the outside world and others. For me, Deleuze and Guattari being Lacan's student and Deleuze being a heavily philosophical thinker, an entirely metaphysical thinker, comes to themselves have the same questions, and they also come to provide some very, very good answers, which also at some level does require at least a certain appreciation for what Lacan is doing. For them, their terms respond to Lacanian questions, such as this one that you've asked, a fantastic one that requires the history of philosophy to even think about. What the hell is a subject? What the hell is consciousness? What we come to realize is that these terms aren't very good, and that we should actually stop using them altogether. And that's what Deleuze and Guattari do with their new terms. They use terms like hexaity, body without organs, plane of immanence, so that we don't have to refer to subjects anymore. Because subjects, they point to things, but we know that these things they don't constitute the problems very well. A subject, or just one subject, but isn't a subject constituted by language, which requires necessarily social relations? Is a subject then a thinking thing or an unconscious thing, or both? Oh yes, but doesn't thought kind of require language once again? And doesn't the unconscious also constitute itself by outside forces? And psychoanalysis tells us that the unconscious is constituted by Oedipus and the Oedipal complex. So one person is always necessarily also their mother and father, but also their pets and their siblings. So, the more we try to answer and tell you a specific thing about what a person or a subject or the relationship between a subject and an analyst is, the more we find points of contention. And Deleuze and Guattari try to wipe the table for us by telling us actually in the fact that you should give up with nouns altogether. You should give up with proper words that point to things. They say that necessarily, by pointing to a thing, you miss the point of it. They use the philosophy of Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher, pre-Socratic philosopher who influences Socrates and Plato. He says, "Panto re," or nothing remains, everything flows. By pointing to a thing, you refer to it as a moment in time. But this can never be the case because everything, including time itself, is always moving. So when you say a tree, you are referring to it at that point in time, at the point of utterance, in the same way that when you say subject, you are referring to a subject at a point in time and space. For D&G, for Heraclitus, this misses the point because whatever it is, and this becomes the most important term of all, which goes against what I'm talking about with phenomenology, with Heidegger, Hegel, blah, blah, blah. They want to refer to ontology, the study of being. Being comes to be one of the most important terms in the philosophy of continental philosophy in this time period of French and German philosophy and of psychoanalysis. Being. The question of subjectivity, of consciousness, of otherness is a question of being. Deleuze and Guattari want us to say actually it's a question of becoming. It's never a question of what one is. It's always a question of what one is going to become, of what one can become. And this is necessarily what then constitutes a subject. A subject is also at the same time their objectivity, the world around them. They are themselves, but they are also at the same time several. They are the analyst. The analyst is them, and at the same time they are split and different. They are not, and this is what A Thousand Plateaus does. Sorry for rambling so much. This is hopefully something that I do much more on Sunday, but I just hope that I can give good quick answers to this, because this is the whole point of doing these free thinkers at the same time. Is the whole point of me doing Lacan and Deleuze and Foucault, is to try and create this wider framework. So when we have a question for one philosopher, we can then use the other two to answer. So sorry, I'll stop before I continue. Are you okay?
Yeah, I said that this is amazing. It was a lovely reading. I enjoyed this very much. I'm gonna be looking forward for other reading sessions. Okay,
Thank you so much.
okay, take care of yourself. Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you for joining. Well, thank you for listening. Thank you for joining this 2-hour reading of Lacan seminars. Starting with Lacan Seminar 1, we've finished the overture and part 1. And next week on Friday, perhaps at the same time, I'll let everyone know within the week, to move on to part 2, to read part 2, and then to hopefully answer some questions and have some discussions. It's free to join. Anyone can join. Anyone can tag along. Anyone can read. I would love to take a little break to sip my coffee and hit my Juul, hit my vape, because a vape bro got a vape, and I can't read if I can't vape. You know what I'm saying, bruh? So if anyone would like to come and join, please absolutely help yourself. These are free. Next, we will be doing Deleuze, and then on Monday, Foucault, and this will be the case for every week until we're finished with them, essentially, until we're finished with the history of Western philosophy through these free thinkers, which will take some time, but oh well, that's how it goes. So, thank you for joining. See you next week. If not, Sunday or Monday. Bye.